More than 4 years on, the automaker's CEO appears to be breaking ranks with many American companies today, offering some harsh words about President Trump's tariff plans. A 25% tariff on all vehicles not made in the United States. If they were made in the United States, there would be no tariffs. It began as a whisper in Detroit, a quiet conversation behind factory doors, and then it erupted like a shockwave across the industrial heart of America. Ford Motor Company, the symbol of American steel, sweat and scale, had just taken a blow that no one saw coming. Factories closed, workers sent home, production lines frozen, and at the center of it all, tariffs. Not from a foreign power, but from Washington. Before we continue, hit that like button to help us beat the YouTube algorithm and to show your support. On May 17th, Ford stunned the nation by announcing it would shut down several of its most iconic U.S. assembly lines. The Chicago plant, where the Ford Explorer and Lincoln Aviator once rolled out by the thousands, went quiet. Michigan Assembly, home of the Bronco and Ranger, halted movement. And with it, thousands of workers were told, go home. Wait for a call. No one knows when it is coming. The reason, tariffs, not the kind that protect, the kind that punish, the kind that were promised to bring jobs back and instead sent them spiraling. President Donald Trump's trade policy had finally reached the assembly line. A sweeping 25% tax on all imported parts and vehicles meant to punish China, and Mexico ended up hammering America's own factories. Ford announced it was facing an earnings hit of over $1.5 billion in 2025. A financial gut punch that no company, not even Ford, could absorb. And so the shutdown began. It did not end with Ford. Across the Midwest, ripple effects exploded. General Motors scrambled to revise its production lines, laying off hundreds while quietly shifting some truck assembly back to Indiana. Stellantis, the parent of Chrysler and Dodge, idled entire plants in Canada and Mexico. But the pain bled straight into Michigan and Indiana, where 900 workers at component plants were laid off overnight. Ford tried to hold the line. It launched emergency pricing changes. The Mustang Mach-E, the Maverick, and the Brono Sport, all made in Mexico, had their prices raised by nearly $2,000 to offset the tariffs. For customers, the shock came fast. For dealerships, it came hard. And for Ford, it still was not enough. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button to show your support to the channel. Behind the scenes, executives warned that even more cuts might be coming. Tariffs had spiked costs on everything from steel to electronics. The Lincoln Nautilus, imported from China, was now too expensive to compete in showrooms. Ford halted exports to China entirely, losing access to one of the world's largest auto markets. The message was clear. Trade war was no longer theory. It was policy, and it was hurting. Trump's response, he did not flinch. When reporters asked about Ford's production freeze, he called it expected. Then he doubled down. They should have brought production back a long time ago. He said, these tariffs are about America first. The statement sent chills through every boardroom in the auto industry. If the president could shrug off Ford's collapse, who was next? The warning signs were everywhere. Stellantis furled its SUV production in Mexico for an entire month. Parts stopped flowing. Assembly stopped moving. Workers went silent. Then the layoffs hit 5 U.S. stamping plants tied to those same models. Morale evaporated. Executives ducked cameras, and the union for the first time in years openly turned on the company. This was no longer about pressure. It was about survival. At GM's Fort Wayne truck plant, where Silverado and Sierra pickups are built, the company tried to make a stand. They added a shift. They hired 200 workers. They restarted a plant that had paused for retooling. The goal, build more trucks on U.S. soil to avoid the tariffs. For now, it worked. But behind that short-term win was a long-term warning. If supply chains do not adapt, even the most loyal plants could fall. Nissan began cancelling US orders for certain SUVs made in Mexico. Toyota slowed shipments. Honda raised prices. The storm was not passing, it was strengthening. And then came the customers. New car prices jumped in April, not just by a few dollars, by over 2.5% in a single month. That was the highest spike in years. Dealerships warned that buyers were rushing to sign contracts before the next price hike. But inventory was thinning, deliveries were stalling, and the models that once lined the lots were vanishing. Ford tried to keep pace. It offered employee pricing to everyone, a move usually reserved for desperate times. The goal was simple: keep sales moving, even as costs soared. But the gamble only bought time. The math no longer worked. At every turn, the supply chain was failing. Auto parts made in Mexico were now 25% more expensive. Cars assembled in Canada were taxed at the border. Components from China, from batteries to chips, faced duties of up to 30%. And the companies that depended on them were being squeezed to the edge. Ford CEO Jim Farley called the new reality the fairest fight in decades. He meant it as optimism, but behind the scenes, Ford was revising its forecasts, slashing guidance, and trying to explain to shareholders how a company that builds nearly 4 out of every 5 of its vehicles in America was still losing. And then came the layoffs in cities like Cusco and Toledo. Workers who had been spared in the last recession were finally hit. Component lines were shut down. Entire shifts erased, and the communities that depend on those wages, the diners, the grocery stores, the repair shops, began to feel it. At the state level, governors called emergency meetings. In Indiana, labor boards issued warnings about rising unemployment. In Michigan, city mayors begged Washington for relief, but the tariffs held. Wall Street watched in disbelief. Auto stocks stumbled, supplier shares cratered, and analysts began warning that if the tariffs persisted, the industry could lose more than 1 million sales this year alone. And what was the message from Washington? No changes. Trump's administration insisted that the pain was temporary, that companies would return, that factories would reopen. But inside the industry, no one was waiting for help. Ford began reconsidering future product launches. GM reassigned engineers. Stellantis froze hiring, and in the background, a whisper turned into a scream. Is this what America first looks like? Because what is being lost now is not just money, it is momentum. The North American auto industry was once a marvel, a tightly integrated machine spanning 3 countries, thousands of suppliers, and tens of millions of vehicles. Now that system is fracturing. Ford cannot simply move all production to the US overnight, neither can GM. Their supply chains were built over decades, optimized for cost and speed. Breaking them apart is not just expensive, it is dangerous. And yet, that is what the tariffs are forcing. Companies are now making decisions not based on efficiency, but on survival. Shift production here, pause shipping there, cancel orders, raise price, hope. And through it all, the worker is the one left behind. For every job added in Indiana, another is lost in Michigan. For every shift increased in Fort Wayne, another is paused in Windsor. It is a shell game, and the pieces are running out. The political divide is growing. Trump says the fight is worth it. Democrats say the cost is too high. And caught in the middle are workers watching their paychecks shrink and their futures evaporate. And what happens next? The industry is bracing for retaliation. China has already imposed tariffs on American cars. Exports are drying up. Overseas markets are shifting to Korean and European models. American cars are becoming too expensive abroad, and soon possibly at home too. And Ford, it is not gone, not yet. But for the first time in generations, it is reeling. And the workers who built this company, who gave it decades, who raised their families on the wages it paid, are asking the question no one wants to answer. Was it worth it? stormy seas. But here's the catch: 90 days is not a lot of time. Rebuilding frozen supply chains isn't as simple as flipping a switch. Factories need weeks to restart. Ports need crews to rehire and retrain. Ship schedules need to be reorganized. The clock started ticking, and the rush to restock was about to hit full force. Because in that short window, the ports would face an onslaught of cargo, the kind of pressure they hadn't seen in months. And that wave would soon test whether the system could handle the comeback or break under the weight. With the tariff cut and the 90-day window announced, retailers and manufacturers didn't just start ordering normally, they started panic buying. Imagine a crowd rushing into a store during the final minutes of a big sale. That's what happened at the ports. Back-to-school supplies, holiday inventory, and especially electric vehicle batteries all flooded the docks at once. This wasn't just a busy season, it was a tsunami of cargo crashing down on ports already struggling to recover. But the problem? The infrastructure simply wasn't ready. Cranes that had been idle for months couldn't suddenly handle this rush. Truck drivers were still scarce. Warehouses weren't staffed enough. So what should have been a comeback turned into a logjam. Instead of speeding up, the supply chain started choking. The panic buying created a new crisis, one born not of scarcity, but of sudden overload. And that set the stage for the port's biggest challenge yet: managing the feast after a long famine. For months, ports were empty, like a town hit by a drought. But now, with the flood of incoming cargo, it's like